There is a mental illness that, in all of history, was ever diagnosed in only one place on Earth. It had a single symptom, but a terrible one. The victim felt an irresistible, compulsive craving to eat human flesh, even when there was plenty of ordinary food around them. And the most horrifying part, the very terror that this might happen to them was sometimes enough to actually drive them mad. In the winter of 1878, a man killed and devoured his wife and all five of his children while he was barely 40 kilometers from a fort full of food. When he was caught, he said he couldn't resist. Something was stronger than he was. But here comes the real twist, the thing that makes this story different from what you would expect. Today, more and more scholars claim that this illness never existed at all, that we invented it. And if they're right, that is somehow even more chilling than any monster. To understand this, you have to go to where it all began. The endless, frozen pine forests of Canada and the northern United States. This is the ancient home of the peoples of the Algonquian language family, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Naskapi, the Innu, and others. And now try to imagine what winter was like there, a few hundred years ago. Not like our winter, with a heated room and a refrigerator. Months of relentless darkness, a cold that kills if you spend a single night out in the open. The hunting grounds empty out. The stores you gathered in autumn dwindle slowly, predictably. And sometimes an entire family is cut off for days, even weeks, in a snowstorm, locked in a single cabin, watching the food run out. These peoples knew exactly where hunger and desperation could lead a person. They knew the dark thoughts that are born in a mind that hasn't eaten in days, with its own family right there beside it. And instead of burying that terror in silence, they gave it a name, a face, a monster, the Wendigo. In their mythology, this creature is the embodiment of a nightmare, a human who crossed a line that should never have been crossed, who ate human flesh, and in doing so lost their humanity. In return, they gained strength, unnatural height, the ability to survive even the harshest winter. But the price was horrific, an endless, unquenchable hunger. Because that is the essence of the Wendigo. It is never full. The more it eats, the hungrier it becomes, an ever-expanding emptiness that nothing can ever fill. In the descriptions, it is often skeletal, yet gigantic, as if hunger itself had taken bodily form and still could not feed itself. But we have to pause here for a moment, because the Wendigo isn't just a scary tale for the campfire. If you look closer, you realize it's actually a brilliant encoded warning. An entire culture poured its greatest, most real fear into the shape of a single monster. The fear that in exchange for mere survival, you might lose everything that makes you human in the first place. The Wendigo didn't come from nowhere. The Wendigo was the human being who gave up. And at some point, the myth crossed a line. It stepped out of legend and into the medical record. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Western anthropologists began systematically recording what they eventually christened Wendigo psychosis. And the description they gave was surprisingly consistent. The pattern supposedly always began in a similar way. A person, typically in the very depths of the long, dark winter, slowly changed. They became depressed, silent, withdrawn. They lost their appetite and began to feel an ever stronger disgust toward normal food. What they used to enjoy, they now couldn't swallow. Then came the terror, a compulsive, dark thought that gave them no peace, that soon they would crave the flesh of those around them, of their own family, that they were turning into a Wendigo. And the more they feared it, the more real it seemed. According to the accounts, some of them at this point begged their own community to do something to them before they could cause harm. And the communities had a dark, final procedure for those they believed had already gone too far. And here come the real recorded cases. The story that made people take this seriously for decades. The most infamous is the case of a Plains Cree trapper named Swift Runner in the winter of 1878 in what is now Alberta. When the authorities finally tracked him down, they discovered something horrifying. His entire family had vanished, his wife and 5 children. They hadn't fled. During the long interrogation, Swift Runner confessed to the unthinkable. He had killed and eaten all of them. And here's the detail that makes this case so shocking, and that stops you from simply writing it off as famine. His camp was only a few miles from a fort where there was food. He should not have been starving, and yet he did it. By his own account, something forced him. In the end, he was hanged. And there is Jack Fiddler, an Ojibwe chief and highly respected healer who became a legend on the exact opposite side. He was the one who killed Wendigos. By his own admission, over the course of his life, he executed 14 people. People his community was convinced had already been irreversibly taken by the sickness. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a healer, a protector. The law, however, saw it differently. In 1907, he and his brother were arrested for murder. These stories, the confessions, the courts, the anthropologists' notes made their way for decades into the textbooks of Western psychology and psychiatry. They were cited as a perfect, clean example of a special phenomenon, the culture-bound syndrome. That is, a mental illness that in theory can exist in only one culture, because only there is the concept, the belief, that brings it to life. And now comes the point where the whole story turns upside down. In the 1980s, an anthropologist named Lou Marano noticed something unsettling. He wasn't looking for new cases. He went back and carefully re-examined all the old ones. All the evidence on which this entire diagnosis, cemented into the textbooks, was built. And he found a stunning pattern. It turned out that not a single Western anthropologist, not a single physician, had ever seen with their own eyes one single active case of Wendigo psychosis. Not one. Every case was secondhand, thirdhand. I heard of a man in another village who, my grandfather told me that in his day there was someone who, in the few real cases, like swift runners, those, if you look closely, can be perfectly well explained by far more ordinary, though no less tragic things. Real famine, severe mental illness that has nothing to do with any particular culture, or simple cold-blooded murder, later placed, for the sake of explanation, into the familiar frame of the local legend. Marahano's provocative, heavy conclusion was this: the Algonquian peoples did not catch Wendigo psychosis. Rather, Western researchers largely manufactured it. They took a powerful indigenous myth they didn't quite understand, hung a Latinate medical-sounding name on it, and turned it into an exotic, catalogable disorder. The illness, at least in part, did not live in the minds of the sick. It lived in the minds of the observers. Now stop for a moment and think about what that really means. If Marahano is right, then an entire scientific profession for decades essentially implied that a whole people had a peculiar tendency toward cannibalism and based all of it on an illness no one had ever directly observed. The evidence was nothing more than the echo of the researchers' own expectations and prejudices handed back to them out of the legends. But let's be fair and look at the other side too, because reality is never simple. There were real bodies. Swift Runner's family really did die, and their deaths were not caused by a theory. The terror, the desperation born of those endless, hungry winters, that was profoundly real. The question was never whether horrors happened in those forests. The question was whether we had the right to call a whole people's illness what was perhaps far more a culture's painfully wise, metaphorical warning about a very universal human danger. So perhaps the Wendigo was never a real monster lurking out there in the snow. Perhaps it was always a mirror, a story a people told itself and us about what anyone can become if one day mere survival becomes more important to them than everything else that makes them human. The question I'd like you to take with you is only this: which do you think is more frightening? A real monster out there in the dark forest on which you can pin the horror, or the realization that maybe we ourselves invented the monster so that we'd have something to point at and wouldn't have to face our own deeply human hunger? Tell me honestly in the comments which one you choose.